how can you continue to sell products and look someone in the eye and tell them that in 40 years from now, that $1 million, $2 million is going to be able to fund any form of retirement?
Bitcoin is the most revolutionary technology. This is the group right here. People in this room are literally the revolutionaries of 1776. I don't think that's an exaggeration.
Yep. This is the apex, not only the apex predator of finance, but it's the apex predator of freedom, human freedom.
Ed, start us off, introduce how you got into Bitcoin and what you're doing in the space.
Yeah, so my TLDR journey, I used to work in traditional finance. I was a financial advisor. Long story short, kind of realized the traditional financial system is a joke. It's a scam. So February 2020, I tried to revisit Bitcoin because I had looked at it in 2017, but I just couldn't understand it. I really, for whatever reason, I tried to read up on it, but I couldn't wrap my head around it. I was too TradFi minded. Saw it as speculation in 2017. Saw it go from 3,000 to 20,000, back down to 3,000. And I was like, yeah, dodged a bullet there, So, but, a couple of years later, after, finding some hard money guys like Robert Kiyosaki, Mike Maloney, I was able to have a better understanding of how this world actually works when it comes to, global macro and financial system. And the fact that this is a debt-based monetary system. So having that base, I was able to revisit Bitcoin in that late February 2020, and it started to click. Fast forward a month or so later, March 2020 hits. We all know what happened there. And Bitcoin, I had started buying Bitcoin in that late February time period, and I knew just enough that when that the global liquidity crisis hit, to go all in, to put the pedal to the metal and really try to buy up as much Bitcoin as I could during that, that drop from 9,000 to 3,500 or whatever it was. And I never really stopped. And it was like a snowball effect. I kept, devouring information, buying and buying. It's like a black hole that sucks you in. You become obsessed. And the more you learn, the more your conviction grows, and the more you feel like you just don't have enough. So I come from that traditional finance world where it's basically the principles there are just the complete opposite of Bitcoin, And once I was, I left the industry, and now I like knowing what I know, I could, as much as you can make a lot of money there. I'm not saying that people in traditional finance are bad people. I think they just don't really understand how this system works. So when I really got a good understanding, I couldn't morally continue to sell financial products that frankly aren't really going to serve anyone when you factor in real inflation. In traditional finance, your report card is CPI, which we know is a joke. If you're beating that 3% fake hurdle rate, it's, you're not really helping people. And if you really dig and you start to understand that most of these financial products are all riding the Fed's the Fed's money printer and manipulation of, the cost of capital, interest rates. So, yeah, I think once you really get a big picture on how things actually work, I don't think anyone can morally, stay in an industry that, you're not really providing value.
I appreciate that, and I want to get into that, your transition from traditional finance to what you're doing now.
Yeah.
But before, you mentioned a couple things that I want to touch on. Number one, right off the bat, you had a hot take for someone who's maybe not familiar, but you said traditional finance is a scam. I've often said financial advisors are obsolete because 95% of fund managers underperform against their benchmarks, not to mention Bitcoin. Almost all hedge funds, almost all financial managers have been decimated compared to just buying and holding Bitcoin. But even so, like if you're a small cap manager, mid cap, like you're literally better off as the end investor or as the retail investor, just going and buying the S&P 500 VOO or whatever, and just buying basically a fund that will outperform somebody trying to get smart and take a cut on the way. So maybe back up that claim a little bit. What were the things that alerted you, and how do you, to somebody who maybe doesn't understand Bitcoin yet, how do you explain how the debt-based monetary system that we live in, paired with traditional finance systems, is ultimately a scam?
Yeah. So going back to like my story when I was learning all this, you start to understand that the traditional financial system it's basically a giant passive index machine. Because in the late 70s, they passed a law called ERISA, which is Employee Retirement Income Security Act, or something along those lines, which basically took the need for companies to fund pensions for their workers, and they actually shifted that toward which it's called defined contribution plans,
So they'll
which is
match
like a
your
401k, which now they would start to take the money from your check and fund your retirement through vehicles like that. What happened there was now these passive machines began to automatically buy, into the equity markets, and that essentially takes out, self-regulating markets. Like there's no real price discovery there if everyone's just constantly buying. And this thing has grown so large that it's pretty much based on a lie. So like you have, and I think Michael Saylor's talked about this, you have 99% of companies basically underperforming inflation, real rate inflation. So you have, and then you have what's the Mag 7 companies pretty much holding everyone else up. It's a fake system. It's not. It's an illusion. We're trained to think that the S&P 500, the 500 largest companies, 99% of them aren't beating inflation, which means you're storing your monetary energy away in something that's ultimately devaluing against hard assets and ultimately devaluing massively against Bitcoin. But the main thing in that system is all of those companies, because we've been in the period of declining interest rates since the early 80s. All these companies and all these people have basically gotten used to operating at low to 0% interest rates, which means a ton of misallocation of capital, a lot of waste. And now when we're so indebted and they need to raise rates to incentivize people to take on more U.S. debt or to buy our debt, people, these bond vigilantes aren't going to accept such low interest rates. But what happens when the Fed raises interest rates? All these companies that have been used to operating at very low to no cost of capital, all of a sudden they're done. We have a quarter of companies in the U.S. that are some like zombie companies, which is they essentially exist just to service debt, and I think that number is growing. So, when you start to pair all this up, so what I used to sell mutual funds. You look in all those mutual funds; it may have a different name, different company. If you look inside of them, it's all the same companies. Few differences here and there, but essentially they're all the same companies. So everyone is just essentially buying the same thing, and then you take that to the next level. Mutual funds typically have higher costs. So what I actually discovered this even before I found Bitcoin, where the average person could just buy an index fund for under 1% and buy the same passive machine, as opposed to me selling all these mutual funds for different companies that was basically the same as an index fund, but just much higher rate. So that was my first red flag. It's like, why am I selling these things that ultimately, does a disservice because you're overpaying for the same thing you can go get in an index fund? I don't know if that makes sense. If you want to clarify anything.
No, 100%. I think what I'm most curious to really get out of you and understand is, I meet a lot of people at these Bitcoin conferences, a lot of people just in the day-to-day that work in traditional finance let me take that back. I've met people today who tell me, hey, I still work on Wall Street. And I'm talking to you, you worked on Wall Street or worked in traditional finance and then decided, based on discovering that this entire thing was a fugazi, that you were going to change direction in your own life because you didn't feel, I'm putting words in your mouth, but you felt there was some type of tension there morally. So I want to get into what that process was like and why you decided to just completely throw your entire career for a loop and then lead us into what you're doing now, because I think it's much more aligned.
Yeah, so I didn't work on Wall Street. I worked for a broker. I was a traditional financial advisor, retirement accounts, things like that. But I think that the moment you realize that you're selling a product and you're telling a client that if you beat a 3% CPI or inflation rate and your product is returning, 8 to 12%, okay? When in reality, we know inflation's much higher when you factor in the cost of energy, food, things they leave out.
Interject real quick why there's a difference between CPI and real inflation.
Because CPI is based on something called hedonic hedonic adjustments.
Hedonic?
Adjustments.
Yeah.
And what happens is they're able to manipulate, as the cost of things change, they're able to manipulate, take in, take out things that suit their narrative. They're able to change, what's in the basket of goods that underlie, their CPI reports. And when they do that, it's always going to suit them, But when you understand how indebted the planet is, every country on Earth is in dollar-denominated debt, and we ourselves are in an insane amount of, pretty much at this point, mathematically unpayable debt in productivity terms. So, how can you continue to sell products and look someone in the eye and tell them that in 40 years from now, that $2 million is going to be able to fund any form of retirement? When I'm from Long Island. $1 million house these days we're talking a little small Cape box. That's $1 million today. So most people aren't, because the cost of living has gotten so high. Most people can't save or put even that much toward these retirement accounts. So let's say you're able to save $2.5 million. What is that going to buy you? What kind of lifestyle is that going to afford you at 65? Let's say you're in your 30s. Does that make sense? Like it's. I guess you can look the other way, but in reality, it's just like, if you understand the system, you know what's going on. I can't see how anyone could understand that and then continue to look someone in the eye or family in the eye and tell them that they're on the right track to I guess a safe or comfortable retirement. It's just not mathematically possible because of the levels of the debt that the United States is, and then the rest of the world as well, in regards to their dollar-denominated debt.
Sure.
So it's like all those currencies collapse first against the dollar, but obviously the dollar's, the last one to die, essentially.
Right. So it's like building a house. The analogy I like to use is building a house, and every, call it 2 weeks, a house maybe takes a year to build. Every 2 weeks or a month, you have to change the measuring stick. So you're trying to build something that literally the measuring stick is changing. So like you said, maybe 20 years ago, being a millionaire, you're doing pretty darn well for yourself. Now it's like $1 million is not enough to retire, not even close.
Yeah,
not even enough to buy a shoebox apartment.
Oh, exactly, and that's one, to go back to that 40 years of declining interest rates. When Volcker jacked up interest rates in like 1981, 82 to deal with the 70s stagflation era. That 40 period of declining interest rates is how real estate thrived, how this, ultimately the stock market thrived, and obviously all the hiccups along the way. 1987 Black Monday, 1998 long-term capital management hedge fund that blew up. The GFC 2008. Every single time the market was supposed to correct itself, essentially, the Fed would step in and manipulate the monetary system. Whether it was, not until 2008 it was quantitative easing, but they're always manipulating the interest rates to, I guess, keep this thing going, which there's a lot more there that would be an entirely different podcast. I think ultimately there's a lot of people in positions that absolutely know that the system's not broken. It's working as designed. Okay, the system is designed to essentially, and so I'm not one of those people that think that they're just miseducated and we just somehow landed at a fiat debt-based monetary system. This system was absolutely put in place. If you study the Great Depression, the central bank, the Federal Reserve, engineered the Great Depression. Ben Bernanke is on tape admitting that it was their fault, however many years later.
The Federal Reserve contributed to the Great Depression in a couple of ways.
So this system isn't by accident. The problem is we're now in a time where they're running out of options to keep this thing going. And I personally think that they're leading us toward a social credit score, debt-based central bank digital monetary system, that's my real importance for Bitcoin. Obviously, people need to store their wealth in something, but let's say they get that system in, and you're let's say you're able to save something, decent for retirement, but it's in a system where they can shut down your central bank phone app if you have the wrong thought or if you say something against the current regime. Those two things, whether it's people having a real hard time to save for retirement and then collapsing the system and then kind of herding them into that new system is the real threat to me. I don't really think so. My journey started with really helping people put purchasing power away in the best possible assets. But when you start to factor in that maybe this thing's by design and they're kind of herding us into a different system, you start to learn this stuff. You can't ignore Bitcoin. You can't ignore the writing on the wall, where we're going. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious the direction things have taken since post-2020 on government overreach, reaching insane new levels. So you got to pair that up with, not only do you have to try and save your monetary energy for the long term in something that's really going to, continue to gain value and ultimately store value, but you also don't want to live in a system that mirrors, the CCP on steroids, in my opinion, because if you really research and understand this stuff, that's the system that these types of digital surveillance state systems that they're trying to bring in around money. It's not a world I want to live in. So I think, Bitcoin, it's one of the most important things the human race can really focus on. Not so much, not only for saving your monetary energy, but to ultimately be free, if that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense to me. You made a bunch of great points there. I'm reading a book right now. It's a dense one, but it's called The Secrets of the Federal Reserve. And
that's by Eustace Mullins.
Eustace Mullins.
So I know we're not getting into this podcast, but I'm a very big conspiracy researcher. So a lot of times I
I like that you call yourself a conspiracy researcher.
Not theorist. Yeah. People that...
These aren't theories.
So, not to sidetrack here, but the CIA Operation Mockingbird in the 1950s was they actually infiltrated the mainstream media to get people to stop people from coming up with any potential theory that goes against the mainstream narrative. So that term conspiracy theory is from the CIA. Okay, so I'm a conspiracy researcher. Obviously, not everything is a conspiracy per se. It could be, because anything more than two people conspiring to bring about some nefarious act or outcome is a conspiracy. And I think if you look at government, it's pretty freaking evident that there are conspiracies everywhere, our government and globally. So yes, I am a conspiracy researcher, and that's my real main reason for Bitcoin. And yeah, Eustace Mullins and The Secrets of the Federal Reserve, you start reading that book, and he's got a bunch of other good ones. You start to see things. And this is the kind of awakening I was talking about in the beginning. It's not so much from the hard money stuff. That evolved to, there's a lot more going on in this world that we don't think. And I think March 2020 really showed that once the dust settled from all that, I think we really see things aren't as they seem.
If you're not paying attention yet, I don't know what you're doing. So the reason I brought up Secrets of the Federal Reserve is because if you read that book, it is beyond apparent, with receipts, with evidence, that the system was absolutely designed to
enslave.
They called it the money trust, right? So it's they rebranded it a couple times. They pushed through the Federal Reserve Act right before Christmas in 1913. People are going off to holiday, and they snuck this thing in. Paul Warburg was a big part of it. Paul Warburg ended up being the director of the Fed. The Fed then is 12 different sub-Federal Reserve banks, so they make it look like to the average person that it's not a central bank. It's 12 banks that all have shares owned by the same people, not just the United States, foreigners, right?
Yeah, see, like the average person's always going to say, oh no, it's the private banks own the Fed shares. You dig deep enough, it goes into trust, and there's elite families that control all this stuff. And again, I'm a conspiracy researcher. So, and there's a lot of receipts out there, very in-depth evidence that people just they've never seen, so they'll brand you as a quack or whatever. But when you sit there and do the work, again, we're in the proof of work. Okay, I have receipts also, stacks of books this big, highlighted, tabbed. I really devote a ton of time to this. All of this, it's a plan. It's very much taking us toward a world of absolute, total control over our ability to stay free. Kind of like the U.S. is like the last bastion. We still have very good rule of law, and if you even research that, you still have access to the laws that the country was founded on. A lot of people think that the Constitution was eroded. Constitution still exists, but you have to know how to access it, and it's not going to be in their certain court system. So, I don't want to go on too much, but yeah, there's a lot there that it makes the need for Bitcoin and understanding Bitcoin is so important. And I think building around, understanding your true ability to practice freedom, merging that with Bitcoin and Bitcoin's inherent properties can potentially give you kind of like an unstoppable force to continue to operate as a sovereign person.
So I had a good conversation with a Bitcoin founder and CEO. His name is Gustavo. He started a company in Mexico, and he made a great point, which I'd like to get your 2 cents on.
Sure.
I asked him at the beginning of the podcast, what are most people missing about Bitcoin or misunderstand? And he said, look, everybody talks about the 21 million, the scarcity, but ultimately the censorship resistance and the ability to transact without any permission is more important than the scarcity, because take away the censorship resistance, the scarcity is irrelevant.
Yeah, and I think that's something that George Gammon, who's here talking at the conference, touched on. In the sense of if you look at the Bitcoin protocol, the way it is, it was encoded with consensus rules, and the way it is in its pure form, Bitcoin, in that sense, Bitcoin has already won. Kind of like the idea of like the Constitution in its pure form is really the best rule of law that I think the human race has ever seen, that at least provides, maybe next to natural law. But when you look at Bitcoin itself, it's something that they can build they can come in and try to do things around it, but they can't change it. So the fact that you can take $1 billion in your head with 12 or 24 words, if you memorize them, go anywhere on the planet, no one can stop you. That is the ultimate freedom. And I think we are at a point now where everyone sees Bitcoin differently. Some want it to be a medium of exchange right away. So admittedly, in the West, I see it as an asset because of the system that I live in. Okay, but if you're someone else in a potentially war-torn country or something, and you need to take your wealth across borders or whatever, Bitcoin allows you to do that. Whereas you're not going to take a bag full of gold. You're not going to take your real estate portfolio of buildings across borders. You're not going to take cash. So try bringing over $10,000 through an airport. Every single other asset can be seized, confiscated. And I'm not saying they won't try to do this with Bitcoin with legal ease. But if you know how to do it right in its pure form, it's very hard to confiscate Bitcoin, if not impossible. And just all these inherent properties, man. This is the apex, not only the apex predator of finance, but it's the apex predator of freedom, human freedom, when you really understand this stuff. So obviously we're in the early stages. A lot of people see it differently. But when you get down to that and you really understand what this thing is, this is the beacon of hope for this planet. Because if the human race doesn't start to, really understand what they have, and of course, number go up is fun. It's great. All that stuff is important, absolutely. But you have to, I think the most important thing that people need to understand about Bitcoin is it's the one thing that provides sovereignty, true human freedom in its pure form. Just like the Constitution did, and they eroded our freedoms around it. They didn't dismantle it. Same way you can't dismantle the Bitcoin protocol or consensus rules, but you can come in and do things around ETFs and all. You can build moats around it that keep you from accessing your freedom. But that's the most important thing, I think, is that knowing all the capabilities of Bitcoin. Not only is the asset, but tool for human freedom.
Very well said.
Yeah,
you got me fired up on the apex predator concept. And I deeply believe that Bitcoin is the most revolutionary thing, technology, protocol, whatever you want to call it, asset that humans have ever discovered.
Yeah, and that's what's beautiful about it is it's so many things.
Right.
That's why it's the apex.
And that's why it's so hard to understand as well. And
it is. It is hard because some people will only see it as money, or some people will only see it as an asset. But it's a tool. It's a tool with multiple heads. And you just have to know, based on your lifestyle or where you are in the world or your situation, which head to use. And they can change at any time. If I'm in the United States, it's an asset. If I go visit El Salvador and I want to participate in the local market, it becomes a medium of exchange or local currency. It's so fascinating when you start to wrap your head around this thing. That's why I get so fired up. And I couldn't, once I started learning about this, how could I not leave everything and try to jump into this industry as much, and do anything I can to bring this forward and help it grow.
So for me, my story with Bitcoin is I knew the Federal Reserve was a private bank when I was 16 years old. I became a conspiracy theorist. I'll call myself a conspiracy.
Before me, 16. That's good. That's a good age.
I was, my long story, but my buddy was coming to chemistry class every day and telling me 9/11 was an inside job. And I would argue so passionately, no chance, man, the government would never do that. There's no way, blah, blah, blah. And eventually he kept bringing links and videos. And I would look at them because I'm curious. And, you know, I still credit him. His name's Josh, man. Once I realized that 2 planes, 3 buildings, and a lot of other unanswered questions, I started to question everything, my religion, all the history that I was taught, and that led me down. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think one of the key things you touched on there is that first reaction is that they would never do that.
Yeah. It would take the whole government conspiring.
You would never do that. You know why? Because you are not a psychopath. Okay, governments are riddled with absolute psychopaths. Why does a serial killer do what he does? Because he's a psychopath.
Yeah.
Okay, we see a lot of these people I'm not going to blanket and say that everyone is bad, but a lot of people in powerful positions across all different sectors of government, whatever, take your department, whatever it is, and beyond that, central banking, all the elements that run the planet, these places are riddled with psychopaths, they want to bring up agendas and outcomes that serve them. Okay, so when you tell the average person something like that, they're first like, oh, they would never do that. No, you would never do that. And that's something I learned from I think he's probably the conspiracy goat, a man named David Icke, who also wrote a 900-page book called The Trigger, which I've also read, tabbed and highlighted. You read that book, you cannot tell me that the absolute mainstream story of 9/11 is an absolute joke. It's a disgrace and an embarrassment that the story they came up with to the people who lost family that day.
100%.
That's who really that's the insult. And to obviously as a nation and everything, the story that they put out is a joke. It's a laughable joke that gets picked apart by anyone with half a brain cell. I understand some people don't want to believe it emotionally. Makes sense. Mm-hmm. But you really start to look at that and so many other things in the world, it all falls apart. Okay, so we have to understand, like, we're up against people who would do things like that.
That's a great point.
And where they control the money, which they do, do we think if we leave them in control, do we think we're going to live in a world with more freedom or less? I think we know the answer. I think we're living in a world that is inching closer and closer in the opposite direction of the ultimate human freedom. So that's why it just brings it back to Bitcoin. It's like you separate money and state, or the ability to control the money supply and the cost of capital. And you bring it now, that's their main element that they use to carry out these acts. How else would they do it? If they can print money, and obviously all the wars engineered, funded on both sides, like all these things, you start to understand that there's a lot more going on. So it just, even to go back to that, it's why you need to understand Bitcoin. Get your foot in the door for number go up, store of value, things in that, absolutely. But you jump head first once you understand what it's really made for.
Absolutely. And to go back to your previous point, if you don't have a problem, you're not looking for a solution. So if you've never had an issue banking, if you make decent money, you have a decent life, you're not necessarily looking to find Bitcoin. And if the programming is very strong, right? From day one in kindergarten, 5 years old, until you're 18 years old, your entire development, most of it, you are basically taught to trust authority, trust your teachers, trust the churches that you go to. And it's a paradigm shattering experience to have to start to question all those things. Even your parents, it's like, holy shit, my parents don't know this. Like, yeah,
the brain's essentially, a computer system, and it gets programs. From the day you're born, you get the software program that your parents put into you. Then you go to school, you get that it's never-ending programming. So yeah, absolutely, it's one of those things where you get to adulthood, and it's so hard to unwire all that programming you received your entire life through endless indoctrination. And I think they're really trying to even take that to the next level these days. So it's like the people that are able to break through that, even here in these the Bitcoin conferences and the Bitcoin community, we may not all be at the same point, but some understanding Bitcoin eventually, I think, brings you to that when you start to see the things that they're trying to do.
Bitcoin teaches you a lot, man.
A lot. It's so fascinating how I get fired up about this stuff, because it's like, what else is more important than true human freedom and the ability to live your life the way you see fit? Which, when someone else controls the money and the value of the money, they ultimately control it. People don't understand where you live, what you eat, how you get around. Start thinking, and you will understand that whoever controls the money controls everything. Obviously, there are people that are better off, and there is capitalism, crony capitalism, but you ultimately do have some leeway. But the direction we're going with these debt levels and things, they're gonna more control is coming, is what I'm trying to say. So the more that control comes in, you're going to need a solution as these totalitarian walls inch in. We really need to push back against that. And I love the brand We Are Satoshi, because the more people that come into this space, however they get here, it doesn't. I don't care if you get here through trading. I got here through shitcoining. I didn't understand this at the beginning. Just the fact that you get here and you continue on, eventually you get to that. I guess that viewpoint where things aren't like they were when I grew up. Things are different, okay? And it ultimately becomes separation of money and state, true human freedom. But that doesn't mean you can't get to that through all these different ways. So it's like, I meet people where they're at. Like you said before, it's in the West, for example, you have Venmo, you have Zelle. You really don't need to use Bitcoin as a medium of exchange there. And I'm sorry, like, people may disagree with that, but ultimately, luckily, we live in a system. It's a debt-based fiat system, but it's still pretty easy to transact digitally through their rails. But if you are trying to store long-term value, to me, Bitcoin is an asset over there. So, yeah, I think, I hope that makes sense. It's just like, you have to meet people where, if you meet someone who just wants to make their dollar value go up and they get to Bitcoin, that's great. We need everyone we need more and more people to join this community. We are all Satoshi. That's what people need to understand. So it's like, you can't push people away if they're interested in trading. Or it's okay, let them get there, but you deliver the information in a digestible way that's ultimately going to get them to where we need to be. You know what I'm saying? Because there's too much pushback from people. It does us a disservice. Meet people, even if they're shitcoiners, whatever. Just it's better to get everyone on our side, because the world that's being built is a world where we need as many eyes on what's really going on. So I say, cheerful and constructive, as Michael Saylor says. He's pretty disciplined. A lot of people come at him hard, and he always keeps his calm. I've
never seen him
lose his cool. Yeah. And at that level, you're going to get heat from different people, but that's the way to be, I think, because we don't want to push people away. We want to bring as many as we can. That's how we win.
Yep.
More and more collective consciousness. So bring them all. I don't care how you get to Bitcoin. You will, if you're there long enough. I got into it one way, and I ended up to what we've been talking about. However they get here is fine. Meet them where they are and guide them, help them, and eventually we get to where we need to be. We win. That's how we win.
So to add on to that, I think there's an interesting dichotomy between the dollar and Bitcoin, where I've had some conversations in the last couple of days here where people bring up this idea of the wealth gap. And I think on the left, especially, the wealth gap is a big thing that people are worried about. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. Everyone knows this.
Yep.
The question is why? And the narrative is early Bitcoin users are benefiting at the expense of the new people. And if you don't understand Bitcoin and you think it's just like the rest of cryptos, you might think it's a scam. But what ultimately, my point on that is ultimately, like, the rules are fair to everyone. So whereas the US dollar is very discriminatory. If you're in Africa, you can't get the US dollar. If you're in El Salvador, El Salvador uses the dollar. If you're in many countries around the world, you have to use your local currency and be debased even more than you would with the US dollar. Whereas Bitcoin doesn't see the color of your skin, doesn't see where you live, doesn't care. It literally treats every single person equally. So it's pretty rich when you see that like ECB article come out about Bitcoin, people getting rich at the expense of new people.
Well, even let's take the example. We're here in Colombia, and I have family here and talk to the locals. There's a sentiment on people that come here and earn in dollars, but because they earn in dollars, they have much more purchasing power than the local people. So what happens is that dollar privilege allows them to, it actually ends up inflating the market here for the locals who earn in pesos. So that's the kind of thing that if it's Bitcoin, if the local has Bitcoin or if the foreigner has Bitcoin, it's the same level playing field. Whereas if you are luckily in the land where you still earn dollars and you go somewhere else, you have an advantage. Bitcoin levels that. So there is no gap. Obviously, you're going to get to levels of wealth by work you put in. I'm not, I absolutely am not one of those people who will disparage, the rich and the poor. Obviously, there is a gap because people in the U.S., again, have benefited from those 40 years of declining interest rates, which have inflated assets. So if you're an asset holder, you benefit greatly from that system. But the thing is, as that wealth transfer starts to shift to Bitcoiners, and people say, there's a long line of proof of work that we did to get here. Yeah. So that's the
It was not luck.
It was not luck. That's the reward we get for avoiding, all the things that, other people do, all the fun and, researching, reading, podcasts, while everyone else is living their lives having a good time, we're there, never devouring information. People like yourselves putting out incredible content. That's proof of work. So you saw the vision early to accumulate and get a good sizable stack. You deserve to be rewarded. That's true free market capitalism. So
and you took a lot more risk back in 2020.
100%. We didn't know where this thing was. I mean, obviously you have an idea where it's going, but you really don't know. You know what I'm saying? Like everyone says, 100K is inevitable, which the least interesting thing about Bitcoin's number go up to me. But again, it is good to see your purchasing power rise for the work and amount of hours you put in. So these crybabies say, it's just going to be a new wealth. There's always going to be a wealth gap. There's always going to be people that do the work and people that don't. And you find yourselves, somewhere along the way. The difference is the poorest people on this planet, and a lot of their countries are that way. If you study Alex Gladstein's work and a lot of other people even deeper in the conspiracy world, which I have, a lot of the poverty in this planet and wealth gap is completely 100% engineered. So you have two worlds. You have the world where you do the work, you get rich, you deserve it, middle class, whatever. But then there's also on a global scale an absolute implemented system where that system does create the horrible poverty we see on this planet. I think billions of people live on less than $10 a day. I don't think we realize how big that wealth gap really is. But on a Bitcoin standard, the planet changes because, you go back to that system, true free market, where what you do rewards you ultimately, if that makes sense. So there's always going to be a wealth gap, but at least with something like Bitcoin and a true free market, your lot in life is based on the work you put in. Whereas this fiat debt-based system, globally, your lot in life as a nation and the people of a nation ultimately depend on your relationship to the dollar and the amount of debt you have and, under the king dollar. So completely on level playing field. So to your point, Bitcoin just levels that off. And then we go back to that true free market type system.
I met a woman yesterday who is from the Dominican Republic. Her parents moved to the States and she became an anesthesiologist. She does well for herself now. And she jokingly said to me at dinner, if my parents didn't move to the States, I'd be cleaning up the chicken coop right now in Dominican Republic. And she was joking, but she was being serious, right? And that's not to say, it's the same. She's the same person. She was born with the same talents. She was going to work hard either way. She was going to be a good person. But because of where she was born, she had no chance unless she moved to the US.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the misconceptions people have is, we need to let everyone else from the world that's impoverished into the United States so they can level play. No, you fix the money of the planet, okay? Because the United States has 325 million-ish people or something like that, and there are billions of people.
Probably a lot more since the Biden administration.
So you don't fix the problem by, overpopulating one sector that has the current, king monetary system. You produce freedom money to the planet. That's the difference, where you don't need to go to the US to get a better life if you're in a country that, happens to be impoverished through this system. Bitcoin, again, now wherever you are on the planet is based on what you do and your proof of work, per se. Yeah.
So I want to ask you about Sovreign, because
Yep.
this is your new role. You went from traditional finance to working in the Bitcoin space. Many people are now thinking, how can I get a toe into this industry, myself included. In the last year, I've been traveling to these conferences, adding value, doing the proof of work, not necessarily getting paid much, if at all, but basically just networking, connecting with people. Why? Because I deeply believe that Bitcoin is the most revolutionary technology. This is the group right here. People in this room are literally the revolutionaries of 1776. I don't think that's
Absolutely.
an exaggeration.
Yep.
1776 temporarily freed a certain geographic area of the world, the United States. We had freedom from 1776. Some people would say it ended in 1812.
1812, 1871 with the Organic Act. We're not getting there.
Yeah, maybe
Sidetracked.
1913. But ultimately, I feel more aligned with my purpose, my what I want to do with my time and energy in this world than ever before. So I want you to comment and give us a little bit about what you're doing with Sovreign, the problems that you guys solve, and why you're working with them.
Yeah. So once I relinquished my licenses and traditional finance, I guess, roles, I was helping in small family business, to pay the bills for a period of time, but I just desperately wanted to break into the Bitcoin space because I was so passionate about it. So I was on Bitcoiner Jobs, and I see a company named Sovreign looking for consultants and different positions. So I gave it a shot, and luckily I was able to get the opportunity to be part of that team as a consultant. So what Sovreign does is we help onboard businesses to integrate a Bitcoin standard into their system, whether it could be treasury reserves or paying employees in Bitcoin, whatever way we try to see the company's needs and find ways to help them, not educate them on Bitcoin and the potential Bitcoin has to elevate their business. Because obviously we've been talking about how hard it is, inflation and things like that. Businesses are feeling this. That's why 99% of companies are underperforming. That's why a quarter of companies in the US are zombie companies. Businesses need to integrate Bitcoin. It's like, again, bringing it back away from like the other topics we were talking about with the conspiracy stuff, just on a narrow, normal, playing field here with Bitcoin. If you integrate Bitcoin into your system, now all those inputs that are, the inputs in your business that are eroding or inflating your input costs, bringing Bitcoin into that, it's kind of like that lifeboat that will save your business from going under. Because most business owners, the entrepreneurs, they take the biggest risk from leaving the comfort of a steady paycheck or that 9-to-5 job to ultimately produce a good or service and try to serve the marketplace. But the problem is, what do we get back to? People that control the money and the cost of capital ultimately determine if your business survives, because their friends get the cheap funding. I guess the corporate behemoths, they're able to borrow at 0%. But if you're a small company with a really good product or service, you're at the mercy of the manipulation of the money system. But now we have the capacity to come in and educate these business owners who are struggling, maybe on the verge of closing their doors, or even just have a giant pile of eroding fiat currency. So whatever the situation is, we try to come in and help educate them and really elevate them and try to make their business not only survive but thrive in this coming world. So yeah, I was super fortunate enough for Sovreign to give me a shot and help me come on the team as a consultant and try to ultimately educate these businesses on all the options they have integrating a Bitcoin standard.
Beautiful, man. Where can people, if they're interested, get in touch with you or find out more about Sovreign?
Yep. So the company is you can find it at sovreign.io. I'm listed on the website, and yeah, I mean that's the easiest way to find me.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ed.
Thanks, Kyle.
Appreciate it, man.
Awesome.